Welcome to the 2022 CGP Reissuance Review. My name is Brandon Rosenboom, lead permit writer of the Construction Stormwater General Permit at the State Water Board and co-chair of the Construction General Permit Training Team. Joining me is Daniel Apt, president of the environmental consulting firm Olanu and co-chair of the Construction General Permit Training Team. Together, we would like to introduce you to the Construction General Permit Training Team, its objectives for the 2022 CGP, and the 2022 CGP Reissuance Review.
Thank you, Brandon. First, we're going to talk about who is the CGP training team. So the CGP training team was formed by the State Water Board and the California Stormwater Quality Association in 2008 to develop the CGP training program. The team works cooperatively with and is an advisory body to the State Water Board and CASCA on the CGP training. We are a collaborative group of construction, stormwater, and erosion and sediment control professionals and trainers. And the goals of the CGP training program are compliance with the CGP, protection of California's waters from stormwater discharges associated with construction activities, and fair, firm, and consistent statewide enforcement of the CGP. The membership composition of the CGP includes State Water Board staff, Regional Water Board staff, staff from CASCA, the co-chairs of the CASCA Construction Subcommittee and Training Subcommittee, CASCA's training contractor, representatives from the Building Industry Association, Caltrans, the California High-Speed Rail Authority, a linear utility representative, MS4 representatives, and experts, including training development experts, BMP implementation experts, and specialty BMP application experts, as well as ex officio members. The CGP training team has 5 subcommittees, including the Content Subcommittee, which develops and updates the core curricula of the QSD and QSP training program, including this 2022 CGP Reissuance Review. The Deployment Subcommittee, which rolls out the QSD and QSP training program, including logistics, developing feedback forms, and pilot training. We have the Exam Subcommittee, which creates the QSD and QSP exam questions based on permit requirements, training content, and implementation experience. We also have the Trainer of Record Qualifications and Oversight Subcommittee, which provides qualification and oversight of our trainers of records. And we have the QSD, QSP Prerequisites and Qualifications Subcommittee, which evaluates and recommends new and existing QSD, QSP prerequisites and qualifications.
Now that we've covered who the CGP training team is, let's discuss what projects they are working on. Following the adoption of the 2022 CGP reissuance on September 8th, 2022, the CGP training team was hard at work developing the 2022 CGP reissuance review with the intent of releasing it during the summer of 2023. With the 2022 CGP reissuance review now published, the CGP training team is taking a look at the existing qualified SWIP developer and practitioner training program and is considering where it can be optimized to include the 2022 CGP requirements. Amending the 2009 training program is critical due to the regulatory transition period that effectively makes it so qualified SWIP developers and practitioners will be practicing at construction sites subject to different permit requirements. Prior to the end of the regulatory transition period on August 31st, 2025, the CGP training team will issue 2022 specific curricula for trainers of record to deliver to prospective qualified SWIP developers and practitioners. Other than those major projects, the CGP training team will also be tasked with advising State Water Board staff on acceptable qualified SWIP developer and practitioner prerequisite certifications and other guidance documents, as well as auditing trainer of record courses. Next, let's talk about the purpose of this training. The CGP training team developed the concept of the 2022 CGP reissuance review to bridge the gap between the 2009 and 2022 permits, since both permits will be effective concurrently for 2 years. This means that qualified SWIP developers and practitioners will need to be familiar with the requirements of each permit and how they apply to the different sites they assist with. The training consists of 5 module groups with a total of 15 modules that will be covered shortly. Each module group is accompanied by a learning comprehension quiz that requires you to pass with all questions answered correctly. You are welcome to have the permit documents open while completing the quizzes. The CGP training team Design the 2022 CGP reissuance review so that you can resume modules and quizzes wherever you left off as to accommodate your busy schedules. This training contains approximately 4 hours of recorded content. This table displays the module groups, the topics covered within those groups, and the number of associated quiz questions. Please take a moment to review the subjects. Each module was developed by the CGP Training Team Content Subcommittee and underwent multiple rounds of internal review. In February 2023, the CGP Training Team hosted a Trainer of Record feedback forum to solicit external feedback on the modules. The CGP Training Team Exam Subcommittee drafted and finalized the quiz question bank, which was further reviewed by other members of the CGP Training Team and the Office of Water Programs at Sacramento State. This concludes the 2022 CGP Reissuance Review Introductory Module. Please proceed to the next training module. Hello, my name is Brandon Rosenboom, and I will be presenting this module on general and administrative changes to the Construction Stormwater General Permit. This module will review how the 2022 permit was restructured, the effective date of the 2022 permit, the regulatory transition period provision for existing dischargers, the notice of non-applicability, what information must be submitted via a change of information in SMARTS, inactive project status for projects with prolonged suspended activities, reducing acreage for residential lots, what is considered a common plan of development, monitoring requirements that were removed from the 2022 permit, and updates to SMARTS. State Water Board staff restructured the permit with the intent to reduce the permit's length, reduce redundancy, and improve navigability. All appendices from the 2009 permit were either removed or renamed as attachments, and the permit documents were reordered to improve flow. Additionally, the 2009 permit's risk level attachments for traditional construction projects were consolidated into a single attachment D. Now, most requirements are generally listed in one section of the permit. In instances where requirements appear in multiple locations throughout the permit, staff made an effort to make them consistent. This table shows the appendices in the 2009 permit were renamed into the 2022 permits attachments. Note that appendices 2, 2.1, and 3 were removed as Appendix 2 is built into SMARTS and Appendix 3 is no longer a requirement for the 2022 permit. Furthermore, attachments B, C, D, and E, as well as Appendix 1 for the 2009 permit, were all named under Attachment D in the 2022 permit. Continuing on, attachments A, A.1, and A.2 for linear underground and overhead projects are now attachments E, E.1, and E.2 in the 2022 permit. The 2022 permit also includes additional requirements for passive treatment, total maximum daily load implementation, ocean plan exceptions, and dewatering, which can be found in attachments G, H, I, and J respectively. So when are all these new requirements going to apply for construction projects? Well, the following timeline depicts major compliance milestones following the adoption of the 2022 permit. Starting September 1st, 2023, the 2022 permit goes into effect, meaning all dischargers that file for permit coverage on or after September 1st, 2023 will need to comply with the requirements of the 2022 permit. The 2022 permit allows dischargers that are specifically deploying Executive Order N7320 to apply for a statewide programmatic permit under the 2009 permit starting on December 17th, 2022. And the aim of this is to facilitate the state's ability to meet the executive order's deadline for providing high-speed broadband internet access to rural communities across California by July 2026. On September 1st, 2025, that is the end of the regulatory transition period, at which point all dischargers will need regulatory coverage for their construction activities under the 2022 permit. I would like to go a little more into detail on what regulatory transition period is. When developing the 2022 permits, State Water Board staff heard concerns about how the new permit requirements would affect the schedules and budgets of projects that have had existing regulatory coverage under the 2009 permit. Recognizing this, the 2022 permit offers existing dischargers with up to a 2-year regulatory transition period. Thus, dischargers that are enrolled under the 2009 permit prior to the effective date of the 2022 permit may continue coverage under the 2009 permit for up to 2 years until August 31st, 2025. Once the 2-year regulatory transition period has ended, all 2009 notices of intent will be administratively terminated, and coverage under the 2022 permit must be obtained by the discharger if they are to continue their construction activities. As mentioned previously, any application received on or after September 1st, 2023 must comply with the 2022 permits requirements. We have received questions about how to prepare SWIPs for projects that obtain coverage under the 2009 permit and are planned to continue construction activities past August 31st, 2025. The discharger will need to prepare a SWIP that is compliant with the 2009 requirements and eventually update that SWIP to be compliant with the 2022 permit. As an alternative, the discharger could prepare a 2-part SWIP that clearly identifies how they are complying with the 2009 permit and 2022 permit, though they should be treated as separate sections of the SWIP, and a schedule of when the project will transition to the 2022 requirements would be helpful in these instances. The 2022 permit includes a provision for applicants to claim that their site does not discharge to waters of the United States through what is called a NONA, or Notice of Non-Applicability, or NONA for short. In order to qualify for the Notice of Non-Applicability, the site must not be located in a watershed that is hydrologically connected to waters of the United States. This means that if a project discharges to a retention basin or detention basin, which has the potential to discharge to waters of the United States, the applicant does not qualify for a Notice of Non-Applicability. The applicant must submit a no discharge technical report that is signed by a California licensed professional engineer or professional geologist with hydrological expertise to obtain a NONA ID. A NONA ID means the discharger is not required to comply with the requirements of the 2022 permit. However, the Regional Water Board staff may require that the applicant reassess their no discharge technical report if the site is hydrologically connected to waters of the United States. If the discharger is unable to provide evidence to their claim, they will be required to obtain regulatory coverage under the 2022 permit. Between the 2009 permit and the 2022 permit, the change of information process still accomplishes many of the same actions, such as updating owner or site information, revising construction dates, and increasing or decreasing the total disturbed acreage. The State Water Board no longer requires SWIP amendments and site map revisions to go through the change of information process, as the discharger can simply upload these attachments in SMARTS, where the submission date will indicate the most recent SWIP. There are some new additions in the 2022 permit as to what a change of information can be used for. Dischargers may now submit a change of information to update their project to an inactive status when the project will be suspended for 30 days or more. Additionally, the discharger may now also submit a change of information to remove completed residential lots that have unfinished yards and landscaping areas from their project's total disturbance acreage value. Additionally, dischargers are required to use a change of information to submit updated post-construction plans and documentation, which will be discussed in a separate module. The 2022 permit incorporates a provision which allows dischargers to update their project to an inactive status via a change of information when all construction activities will be suspended for 30 days or more. In order to update the project's status to inactive, dischargers must submit the following documents in the change of information: a revised site map depicting the current status and construction of the site, and photographs depicting temporary stabilization best management practices that will be implemented during inactivity. Once the Regional Water Board approves the change of information, the project will be considered inactive. However, an inactive status does still require periodic inspections, once by the qualified SWIP developer within 14 days of the change of information approval, and then once monthly and prior to qualifying precipitation events by either a qualified SWIP practitioner or their trained delegate. In order to resume all construction activities, dischargers would need to submit a new change of information with an updated SWIP. It is kind of our expectation that projects that encounter unexpected delays or shut down for their winter will be using this inactive project status provision. The 2022 permit incorporates provision for dischargers such as large housing developers to remove residential lots that have unfinished yards and landscaping areas from the project's total disturbance area via a change of information. In order to remove residential lots, the following criteria must be met. The residential lot has been sold to an individual homeowner for residential use. A certificate of occupancy or equivalent document is maintained on site and can be made available during inspections. The lot must be less than 1 acre of disturbance. All construction activity conducted on the lot by the discharger is completed, and the discharger has installed temporary best management practices to stabilize the unfinished yards and landscaping areas. The discharger will be required to upload documentation of a contract within SMART, such as a covenants, conditions, and restrictions contract, requiring the individual homeowner to stabilize the yards and landscaping areas within 1 year and to maintain the temporary best management practices until that stabilization is met. Next, let's talk about the larger common plan rule, where if a project is less than 1 acre of land disturbance, it may still need coverage under the construction stormwater general permit if the larger common plan of development totals 1 or more acres of disturbance. This rule was established by the US EPA to avoid projects artificially escaping permit coverage. An example project might be a residential or commercial development where all the lots were graded together, but each building is owned and developed by separate entities. The larger common plan rule is not necessarily something that's new to the construction stormwater general permit, but I did want to highlight a clarification to the rule. The water boards have implemented a business rule for the 2009 permit that considers the distance between projects within a larger common plan. If they are greater than 1/4 mile apart, they would no longer be considered a larger common plan of development. However, if there is a road, pipeline, or other utility projects connecting the two sites, they could be considered a single project. That is if they're being concurrently worked on. And the same business rule is going to be applied for the 2022 permit as well. Of the many differences from the 2009 permit, I did want to emphasize 2 significant monitoring requirements that were not included in the 2022 permit: bioassessment monitoring and rain event action plans, otherwise known as REAPs. Bioassessment monitoring was removed because it was determined by the State Water Board staff that requirements were not being consistently implemented and sufficient data was not being generated. The data obtained could not justify the cost of compliance for implementing bioassessment monitoring at these project sites. Bioassessment monitoring was replaced with the acknowledgement that water boards staff could allocate a portion of the annual fees from the risk level 3 and LUP type 3 sites to perform monitoring, sampling, and/or bioassessment monitoring through our surface water ambient monitoring program and determine the impacts of these large high-risk construction projects on water quality and watershed health. Rain event action plans were removed because the regulated community desired more action-based requirements rather than reporting-based strategy implemented through the rain event action plans. The 2022 permit replaced rain event action plans with increased qualified SWIP developer involvement over the entirety of the project, additional visual inspections and observations, and an increased requirement to document and implement corrective actions. Lastly, I wanted to touch upon some updates that are coming to SMARTS. State Water Board staff is tasked with updating SMARTS so that dischargers can report information and as required by the 2022 permit. This includes different applications such as the programmatic permitting option and notices of non-applicability, as well as new monitoring reports for dischargers complying with TMDL implementation requirements. Staff will also be redesigning SMARTS to improve the user interface for the 2022 permittees. However, SMARTS will remain the same for dischargers complying with the 2009 permit. SMARTS will be ready by the effective date of the 2022 permit, so keep an eye out for SMART-specific training and guidance prior and likely after September 1st, 2023. So what are some key takeaways from this module? Dischargers with existing regulatory coverage under the 2009 permit can continue complying with those requirements until September 1st, 2025, thanks to the regulatory transition period. Changes of information are required to change the risk, construction start and end dates, disturbed acreage, and update post-construction plans, but are no longer required for updating the SWIP and site maps. A change of information can also be used to switch a project with suspended activities to inactive status, which reduces the required monitoring for the site. Two major monitoring requirements have been removed: bioassessment monitoring and rain event action plans, and will no longer be required in the 2022 permit. And SMARTS will be updated with a new design and additional functionality to accommodate new permit requirements. Thank you. This concludes the module on general and administrative changes to the construction stormwater general permit.
Hello, my name is Katie Whiteside, and I will be presenting this module on programmatic permitting. The learning objectives of this module are to understand what types of projects qualify for programmatic permitting, what the requirements are for the programmatic permitting under the 2009-0009 DWQ, also known as the 2009 CGP, what the requirements are for the programmatic permitting under the 2022-0057 DWQ, also known as the 2022 CGP. There are two types of linear projects that may qualify under programmatic permitting. One are broadband projects required to comply with the governor's executive order in 7320, and linear underground and overhead projects, also known as LUPs or LUPs. Note that only broadband projects subject to Order in 7320 are eligible for coverage under the 2009 CGP until the 2022 CGP becomes effective on September 1st, 2023. LUPs are eligible for programmatic permitting under the 2022 CGP. Broadband projects may obtain programmatic permitting under the 2000 CGP if they are: one, subject to the order in 7320 and located throughout two or more regional water board boundaries, are a group of projects outside of a construction project otherwise regulated by the general order, and have the same legally responsible person, also known as the LRP. LUPs, they could submit one notice of intent requesting regional programmatic permitting for multiple non-contiguous LUPs if the projects are located within one regional water board, have similar scopes with common construction activities, and have the same LRP. So as part of this, you're going to need to develop a common SWIP, and it's to be submitted covering all the activities common to the projects, and they shall contain information on the requirements to be complied with for each risk type expected. So what this means is if you want to obtain a programmatic permit in one regional board, what you'll need to do is anticipate whether or not you're going to have the risk types within that regional permit. And if so, you need to make sure you include in that SWIP information on what the requirements are to comply with each of those risk types. Once you have filed for it and you've obtained your permit, The programmatic permit in itself will obtain a single waste discharge identification number, the WDID. And here's where this differs from regular routine projects. When you're doing programmatic permitting, you're going to have the primary SWIP. And then what you're going to do is you're going to have what is a linear construction activity notification for each non-continuous project or segment that you're going to include for coverage or to be included as part of the programmatic permit. The LCAN, it's required to be submitted before any construction activities for that segment may commence. And then also one thing to note is that the LCAN under that programmatic permit, it'll share the common WDID, but it will be assigned a WDID extension to identify and track the individual projects for each LCAN. Also, the discharges covered under the programmatic permitting, you're required to post the project-specific WDID number and a site location that is visible to the public or readily available upon request if unable to post publicly. In the LCAN, you're to include specific information on where it'll be located. This also includes a site-specific SWIP map, total disturbance acreage, what your schedule is going to be, the risk type determination, and the site contact information. Typically, annual reports are prepared for each WID. However, when you have a programmatic permit, this will be a little bit different, where there will be one main WDID. However, you will be submitting an annual report for each LCAN associated with the main WDID. So each LCAN report is required to be maintained a minimum of 3 years after submittal. And just like normal or routine projects, the annual reports are due on September 1st each year. Once construction activities are complete and a notice of termination criteria has been met for an LCAN, a linear construction termination notification is to be prepared and submitted. This notification is to demonstrate that termination conditions have been met and include photos. Each LCAN must receive approval for termination of coverage. Should the programmatic permit in itself no longer be needed, the general notice of termination process is to be followed. So to recap, summary of the key points are: programmatic permitting is available for broadband projects subject to Governor's Order N7320 on December 7th, 22 under the 2009 CGP until September 1st, 2023. Programmatic permitting for LUPs will be available starting September 1st, 2023 under the 2022 CGP. Programmatic permitting are region specific. So if you work in multiple regions, you will need a programmatic permit for each region. So each regional board's jurisdiction. To qualify for a programmatic permit, the work will need to be similar scopes with common construction activities. Each LCAN will have its own annual report, and each LCAN will need to be terminated separately. Thank you. This concludes this module on programmatic permitting.
Hello, my name is Jeff Endicott, and I will be presenting this module on post-construction submittals. The module learning objectives are to identify the projects subject to the post-construction requirements of the construction general permit and to identify the post-construction documentation and submittals required to obtain, maintain, and ultimately terminate coverage under the construction general permit. So let's look a little bit at what projects are required to comply with the post-construction requirements. Linear utility projects. Linear utility projects are not required to comply with the post-construction requirements of the CGP. The rationale behind that is the requirements don't apply due to the nature of linear construction to return project sites to pre-construction conditions. Waiver projects are also not required to comply with the post-construction requirements of the CGP. The rationale there is the requirements don't apply because a waiver project has no coverage under the CGP. However, it is important to note that projects may be subject to the local agency requirements for post-construction standards. Traditional projects are required to comply with the CGP's post-construction requirements. And there's two types of traditional projects. Projects that are subject to the post-construction requirements of a phase 1 or phase 2 MS4 permit, and other projects. Let's take a look at both those projects subject to a phase 1 permit and other projects. The post-construction requirements for projects subject to a phase 1 or phase 2 MS4 permit are pretty straightforward. Those projects are required to implement BMPs to reduce runoff and pollutants and stormwater discharges that are reasonably foreseeable after all phases of construction have been completed. They are required to comply with the post-construction requirements in the applicable NPDES phase 1 or phase 2 MS4 permit, and they need to submit required documentation to demonstrate compliance with the requirements of that NPDES phase 1 or phase 2 MS4 permit. Other projects are a little bit more complicated, but not substantially more complicated. They are required to implement BMPs to reduce runoff and pollutants and stormwater discharges that are reasonably foreseeable after all construction phases have been completed at the site. They are required to comply with the post-construction runoff reduction standards in the construction general permit, and they're required to submit documentation to demonstrate compliance with the CGP's post-construction standards. In addition, all other projects are required to use non-structural and or structural measures to replicate the pre-construction water balance. And that's going to be based on the volume of the larger of the following: the smallest storms and up to the 85th percentile 24-hour precipitation event, or the smallest precipitation event that generates runoff. Basically, it's going to be the larger of those two. In addition, other projects that are greater than 2 acres in size are required to preserve the pre-construction drainage density for all drainage areas serving first order or larger streams. And they are required to ensure that the post-construction runoff time of concentration is equal to or greater than the pre-project time of concentration. Now remember, a first order stream is a stream that has no tributaries. In this diagram here, the streams that are labeled with a 1, those are first order streams, and of course second order, third order, and fourth order streams are further downstream and follow. Let's now move on to the post-construction document submittals. Let's talk about the submittal points and the documentation details. There are basically 3 points in the project where documentation for post-construction requirements are submitted. Those are at the permit registration document phase, that starts at the beginning of a project, the change of information phase, which happens during the implementation of a project, and at the notice of termination phase, which of course is at the end of a project. Post-construction submittals with the permit registration documents. When do you submit these? You submit these when you're applying for CGP coverage prior to starting construction. And where do you submit those plans? Well, you submit those plans via SMARTS, and that's the Stormwater Multi-Application Reporting and Tracking System. What do you need to submit? You need to submit plans, calculations, and other documentation supporting compliance with the post-construction requirements of a phase 1 or phase 2 MS4 permit, and approved by the MS4 permittee for projects that are located in a phase 1 or phase 2 MS4 permit area, or for other projects, compliance with the post-construction standards of the CGP itself. What do you need to submit? Well, dischargers subject to the post-construction requirements of a phase 1 or phase 2 MS4 permit need to submit an attachment or web source containing the applicable phase 1 or phase 2 MS4 permit or the MS4 permittee's post-construction requirements. You also need to submit documentation submitted with the PRDs. They need to be certified by the discharger. Now, it's important to note that when preliminary post-construction plans are submitted as a PRD, then approved plans and calculations shall be submitted via change of information within 14 days of approval by the MS4. What this means is that under some circumstances, you can actually get coverage under the construction general permit with preliminary but approved post-construction plans. But you do need, within 14 days of those plans being approved, you do need to submit those via COI. It's important to be advised, submittals to SMARTs are publicly available to individuals and organizations that have historically not had easy access to these types of plans. And that means that owners, plan developers, and approving agencies can expect a higher level of scrutiny of the post-construction plans than they've experienced in the past. Furthermore, regional water board staff may review post-construction plans, calculations, and supporting documentation, and they may request that the discharger make revisions if necessary. Now, what to submit for changes of information? Project subject to a phase 1 or phase 2 permit. If you submitted preliminary plans with your PRDs, then within 14 days of the MS4 permittee's approval of your post-construction plans, you need to submit those via a COI. Project subject to a phase 1 or phase 2 permit order and other projects, you need to submit any changes prior to the notice of termination where post-construction plans and calculations have been revised. And where do you submit these? You submit them via SMARTs. Now, the key point here is that you can't use the NOT process to document changes in your plans. In other words, you can't use the NOT to document changes that you made from the documents you submitted at your PRD stage. What you need to do, even if you're right near the end of the project and you're ready to terminate, if you've had changes in your post-construction plans, you're going to need to submit a COI via SMARTs, and then you can move into the NOT or notice of termination stage. For changes of information, what do you submit? For projects that are subject to a phase 1 or phase 2 MS4 permit, you need to submit the MS4 permittee approved post-construction plans and calculations. For projects that are subject to a phase 1 or phase 2 MS4 permit and other projects, you need to submit revisions to post-construction plans and calculations. Again, be advised that COIs submitted via SMARTs are publicly available to individuals and organizations, and owners, plan developers, and approving agencies can expect a higher level of scrutiny of changes to the project than they've experienced in the past. And we all know that during or near the end of construction is a really bad time to find out through outside party scrutiny that post-construction plans or calculations fail to comply with requirements. Post-construction submittals with the notice of termination. When do you submit these documents? Well, when you're filing your notice of termination for coverage under the construction general permit. You submit these documents like everything else via SMARTs. And what do you need to submit? You need to submit documentation demonstrating compliance with the CGP's post-construction features. You need to submit photos demonstrating final stabilization and implementation of post-construction BMPs. And you need to submit a final site map showing specific erosion control BMPs, including final landscaping and the location and orientation of photos submitted to demonstrate compliance with the post-construction requirements and/or standards. In other words, on the final map, you need to show the angle you've taken all the different photos from to demonstrate what types of post-construction BMPs have been installed on the project. You need to submit documentation that soils disturbed by construction have been permanently stabilized by one or more of the following methods: the 70% method, the Russell or Russell 2 method, or the custom method that's been approved by the regional board, along with photos demonstrating compliance. You need to submit photo documentation of your post-construction BMPs. And this is new now, you need to submit a long-term 5-year minimum maintenance plan for the post-construction BMPs that are being implemented on your project. So summary of key points. The means and methods used on a project to comply with the post-construction requirements or standards included in the construction general permit must be documented throughout coverage under the construction general permit. So to begin CGP coverage, submittals are required with the permit registration documents. When changes in prior submittals occur, submittals documenting the changes are required to be submitted with a change of information. And to end coverage under the CGP, submittals are required with a notice of termination. For projects subject to the post-construction requirements of a phase 1 or phase 2 MS4 permittee, much of the required documentation for submittals with your PRDs and COI can be accomplished by uploading documents that the MS4 permittee has already approved, such as the post-construction water quality management plan, SUSUMP, C3 document, or SQUIP. For other projects that are subject to the post-construction standards in the CGP, The required documentation for submittal with the PRDs can likely be extracted from the project's design documents. In other words, the key point here is that you're not going to have to generate a lot of new information if you're the QSD on a project. Most likely, most of this information is going to having been generated by somebody else during the project planning, design, and approval phase, and you're going to simply incorporate it into the project. Thank you very much. This concludes the module on post-construction submittals.
Hello, my name is Katie Whiteside, and I will be presenting this module on notice of termination changes. The learning objectives of this module are to understand the termination requirements under the 2009-009 DWQ permit, known as the 2009 CGP, and how it will be affected by the 2022-0057 DWQ permit, known as the 2022 CGP. And then also understand the termination requirements under the 2022-0057 DWQ permit. So under the 2009 CGP, for projects that are going to continue coverage, the termination process will basically remain the same during the regulatory transition period. However, it is important to know that projects covered under the 2009 CGP will be administratively terminated on September 1st, 2025. So what this means is if you need to have continued coverage after September 1st, 2025, then you're going to need to file for permit coverage prior to August 31st, 2025 for continued coverage. And just to understand, that would not continue under the 2009 CGP, but that would be obtaining permit coverage under the 2022 CGP. So for termination under the 2009 CGP, it'll basically be the same, or it is the same as it's been. So there's the notice of termination. It must include the NOT, and that is to be submitted in SMART, a final site map and photos. And then of course, you're going to need to demonstrate that the site meets all of the required termination criteria and that final stabilization is achieved by one or more of the following methods: the 70% final cover method, the Russell or Russell 2 method, and the custom method. Under the 2022 CGP, you'll still follow what you did for the 2009 CGP. However, there are some differences. One of the differences is that the QSP is to perform the final NOT inspection and prepare the NOT. So this will be a change from the 2009 where it's specifically noted that that is required. Also, there is some more clarification on information on what's to be included on the final site map. We'll go over that here shortly, as well as photos demonstrating final stabilization and the applicable post-construction BMPs and or low impact development. So some of the new elements required in the final site map are shown here, and this is where you're going to need to include more information. And that's where it's really important to make sure that you're keeping track of what orientation you're taking your photos so that you can include them on the final site map. Also, the photos, they should demonstrate final stabilization has been achieved. And this is shown by using different, you could show what types of final stabilization BMPs, the permanent erosion control features, the post-construction and low impact BMPs. And so you'll need to make sure that you do use a legend with shading, different types of patterns, symbols, different ways for the reviewer to be able to tell what you've included as part of your final stabilization, including your post-construction BMPs and your low impact development features. And then you need to also make sure that if you are going to be transferring any or all of the property, that is clearly delineated or outlined on the in the information, and you're going to need to include the name and contact information of the new owner. So in the 2022 CGP, they did add an additional clarification for final stabilization methods, and that final stabilization BMPs are to have a product life that support the full and continued stabilization of the site. In other words, if you're going to do, say, for example, a hydromulch, it needs to be done at an application rate that will support stabilization at a rate that's sufficient. So typically you would follow the manufacturer's recommendations. Another thing is achieve stabilization without becoming trash or debris, and minimize the risk of wildlife entrapment. And the final stabilization methods, they're the same as the 2009 CGP, with the exception of defining that the 70% final cover method specifies that is referencing 70% vegetative cover to be evenly established over 70% of all disturbed and exposed areas of the soil. That's according to what the pre-construction conditions were. So this is another area where it's really important that you do take pre-construction photographs. It's very helpful in being able to demonstrate that you are achieving 70% of the pre-construction vegetation conditions. And then again, just emphasizing that all three final stabilization methods, they do require photos to demonstrate achievement of final stabilization criteria, in addition to information that might be needed. For example, for the Russell 2, you'll need to provide computational proof. And the custom method, you'll need to make sure that the photos will demonstrate that you have achieved final stabilization requirements, along with your explanation that you'll be providing and the map that shows what types of stabilization methods you'll be using. One area that we found is that may be confusing for folks is that they think that they can only use one type of stabilization method. That's not correct. You can use one or more, so it may be a combination of these methods. The QSP is to perform the notice of termination final inspection, and they're to verify that the project meets the NOT criteria, and also, as applicable, that the post-construction BMPs and LID features have been installed. The QSP is to use the information gathered and photos taken during the NOT final inspection for preparation of the NOT. Part of the NOT documentation is to include the long-term maintenance plan for post-construction stormwater runoff BMPs or LID features being implemented. Also, one thing to note is that in the NOT, that you are to make sure that if you have a change of ownership, that is going to need to be documented in the NOT documentation. Just like the 2009 CGP, the NOT for the 2022 CGP is required to be submitted through SMARTS, and that is subject to permit requirements until approval of the NOT is received from the Regional Water Board. One key change in the 2022 CGP is that if no action is taken by the Regional Water Board after the NOT has been submitted, examples of this is action by the water board would be accept for review, deny or return the NOT. So if they have not taken action on the NOT that has been submitted, then the NOT will be automatically approved 30 days after the NOT is submitted. So a summary of key points from this presentation is that project coverage on the 2009 CGP will be administratively terminated on September 1st, 2025, if not terminated previously. The QSP is to perform an NOT inspection to verify that the project meets the NOT criteria. 70% final cover method has been defined to be 70% permanent vegetative cover of pre-construction vegetation levels. Documentation must demonstrate that all NOT requirements have been met, and this includes through photo documentation, description of the corresponding location or locations, final site map showing final stabilization BMPs, post-construction BMPs, low impact development features, and orientation of photos taken. Thank you. This concludes the module on notice of termination changes.